The UseReducer hook is used to manage your application state in React. So in React, you can either use the UseStateHook or the UseReducer hook to manage your application state. UseReducer hook is mostly used to manage more complex and related state than the UseStateHook. So most of the time, UseStateHook might be enough, but when your application is big and has some form of related state which is complex, then UseReducer hook might make things easier in that case. And in this video, we will work on a simple to-do app to see how we can make use of the UseReducer hook to manage state in React application. So all I have here is an input field and a button to add a task. They are currently not functional, but we are successfully updating the value for our input field by making use of the UseStateHook. So I have this piece of state right here, task, set task, and we are making use of the UseStateHook. And when I come here, you'll see at our input, we have an onChange event, and we are simply updating the task using the value that we enter right here. Okay, so how can we make use of the UseReducer hook to add a task? To make use of the UseReducer hook, you just need to import it normally. Right here, we'll just say UseReducer, and we invoke it at the top level like the UseStateHook. So we'll say UseReducer, we invoke it. It usually accepts two main arguments here, and it also has a third argument which is optional. So in this case, I'll just show you with the two main arguments that we are required to pass. The first one is a reducer function. And this reducer function is simply used to update the state. So we haven't created it yet, but we will. So we pass a reducer there. And then the second argument is usually a default state. And in this case, we will pass an array. Okay. So this will return an array with two stuff. So we can destructure those two stuff here just like this. The first one is the state. So here we can say tasks, which will now be our state. And then we also have a function, and we'll call this function dispatch. And we usually make use of this dispatch to send actions to this particular reducer function. And then this reducer function will update the state and cause our component to re-render. Okay. So basically this dispatch will be used to dispatch actions or send actions to this particular reducer function, and then this reducer function will know what to do with those actions. Okay, so let's create this particular function called reducer. Right here, we'll say const reducer will be equal to, we invoke it. It will have two parameters here, state and action, and then right here we set it to be an arrow function, and we do stuff in here. So the thing is, this dispatch will dispatch an action. Simply, it will send an action to this reducer, and we will receive that action right here. And we will use that action to correctly update our state. And initially, this state right here will be this default state that we pass right here. So by default, it will be an empty array. But you can have it as any other data type, an object, a string. You can have it as an array or any other. In this case, array makes sense because we want to have an array of tasks. So in this reducer, we usually make use of a switch statement, and we usually check the type of our action right here. And according to the type, we correctly update the state. But you can also have a default action right here, which will be to return the default state. Okay, and I'll explain to you the flow as we move on. But if you have used Redux before, these are common terms: dispatch, reducer, action, because UseReducer uses the Redux pattern to handle the state. How can we add the task now? All we need to do is to come in here. First of all, we are checking if the task is empty or not. So if it's not empty, we go ahead and we submit our task. And what we will do right here, we will call this dispatch. So we'll say dispatch, we invoke it, and right here we'll pass an object. And this object is now what we are calling an action. So this object must have a type. So in this case, we'll say the type is add, and optionally, it will have what we call a payload. So payload is any other data that we might need to update the state. And in this case, we need this task so that we can add it to our list of tasks. We pass a property called payload, and we'll say the payload here is our task, like that. So whenever we do this dispatch will send this action to our reducer function. So our action has a type and a payload. Sometimes you might have only the type, and in some cases you'll also have the payload, like in this case. Okay, so once we get the action, we switch the action.type, and then right here we can now use a case to check what type we have. So here we'll say case if action.type is add, then we will correctly update our state right here, and we can just return, and what we will return is the previous state. So we spread the previous state, and here I want us to add a task. Remember, our task right here is just a string, but I also want it to have an ID, so I'll pass an object with ID, and I can set the ID to be date.now so that it's unique. It's an easy way to set up an ID there, and I'll add a title, and the title in this case will be action.payload. So remember, our payload is the one that is having our task here, and our task is whatever we type here, and that's what I'm calling the title right here. Okay, so this is how we can simply update the state using the UseReducer hook. I know it's a bit complex than the useState hook, but when it comes to more complex state and complex application, these can really come in handy. Okay, because the state here is related, all the actions that we'll be performing here are related, and it's an easier way to update the state if we have complex state. Okay, let me also come at the very bottom here. Now that we added our tasks, now that we added these, I can uncomment these, and what this does, it is mapping through our tasks. We get a task at a time, and we show the title and a delete button. So when I save here, we don't see it, but whenever we add a task successfully, it will show. So let's say here, run UseReducer. I click on add, and look, we are able to list that task right here, meaning that it was added to our list of tasks. Then I can say run use state, and I click on add, and it's down here. So you can see our tasks here is being updated by our UseReducer, and once it updates, it is performing a re-render, and that is why we are seeing the new task being added here on the screen. So let's have just a recap of the UseReducer hook. The first thing is to import it. Once you import it, you will pass two things to this UseReducer hook. We pass a reducer function, and this reducer function is used to update the state. Then we pass the default state. So this reducer function, the default state to begin with will be this empty array. Then this UseReducer will return exactly two things in our array right here. It will return the state, and it will return a function that we can use to send action. And actions looks like this. An action has a type, and optionally it has a payload. And once we call this dispatch, it will send this object to the reducer function right here behind the scenes. So we don't directly see it here. And once this reducer receives this action, we can check its type. So we make use of a switch statement. You can also make use of an if statement, but switch statement is a more common pattern. So action.type, then we check, is that action.type an add? If it's an add, then we update the state like this. We add a to-do to our state. Okay, if it's a delete, then we will remove a to-do from the state. If it's marking a to-do as complete, then we will update a to-do. If it's clearing the state, we will have all that kind of related actions to that particular state right here, which is easier to manage if it's a more complex state. Okay, and that is why I chose to do a to-do app right here instead of a simple counter, so that it makes more sense. Okay, So now let's see how we can delete a to-do. So to delete a to-do, we will be clicking on this button. So when we click on that button, we will call this handle delete task, which is a function receiving our task ID. And this is the function right here. It's receiving that task ID. And all we need to do right here is to dispatch an action. So I can actually copy this, and I'll paste it here. So we dispatch an action. I told you action is this particular object, and here we will say that in this case we want to delete a to-do or a task, and right here we will pass that task ID. So I pass the task ID. Then we come back to our reducer function and we add a case. This was the first case. Then here we can add a second case. And in this case, we'll say that this is a delete action. So we check, is this a delete action? Then down here, we correctly update our state. All I'll do is that I will return our state.filter. So remember, state is an array. I will filter out a to-do. So here we'll have a task at a time. Then I'll check the task.id. So if the task.id is not equal to our action dot payload, remember action dot payload is the one having our ID. Okay, payload is having our task ID. So we check if this is not equal to this, then we will return that particular task in the new array. Remember, this filter will return a new array, and that array will have a new data depending on the condition that we pass right here. So basically this will remove the to-do that we delete, and the new array that will be there will only have the rest of the tasks or to-dos. And let's see if it can delete. So let's delete this learn use state, and look, it is gone. I delete this one and it is gone. So it is working well. Can add anything and I can delete it. This is how we can make use of the UseReducer hook to handle the state. Okay, basically we will be dispatching actions, then we will be making use of this reducer function right here to check which action that we have. If it's add, then we handle the state. If it's delete, we handle the state. If it's update, we handle the state, and so on. Okay, now one last thing that I want to tell you is that when making use of the UseReducer hook and working with complex state, these cases can become like confusing. You can make a mess, you can confuse the spelling, and if you make a mess on the spelling, it will not work. For example, if I remove this AD and save, you'll notice when I type here and add, what it will do is that it will check for each case. Do we have add? Is our action.type delete? If it does not find this AD here, it will just return the default state. Okay, so we usually create some constants so that you don't mess up with the type. Okay, so let me show you how you can do that. Right here, you can just have const action types. We set it to be equal to add underscore task full colon. This will be add. Then we will have here delete underscore task. Then this one will be delete. So what we have done, we have created an object for the different types that we are having, and then we can easily reuse each of these properties across our application. So for example, for add, instead of just this, I'll use Control D to highlight even the one at the bottom, and now I can say here action types, and I'll say dot add task. Okay, like that, and we will do the same for this delete. So I highlight this, I remove that, and I can say action types like that, then dot delete task, and I go ahead and save. So what is the important of this? This means that even if we make a change here like that and go ahead and save, our application will still work because we are reading the same value for this case and this case or any other case that we will be having. So here, if I go ahead and add, it is adding, although I changed the value right here. Even if it's that, and I happen to save, and we add, it's adding. So this is really cool for big applications to avoid making a mess on your types. So that is the UseReducer hook. You can use it to manage more complex state and state that is kind of related. And you can make use of the useState hook to work with just the normal state or the simpler state on your applications. So how you handle the state is usually your choice, okay? So you can either use UseReducer or the useState hook to manage your application state. So that is it about the UseReducer hook. If you find this video helpful, I'll leave a link to the playlist for other hooks tutorials, and yeah, you can go and watch them if you haven't already. Leave a thumbs up, and I'll see you on the next one.